And away we go.
There's no more effective way of pinpointing a problem or potential problem than locating its source through the process of troubleshooting. And to troubleshoot effectively, one must analyze the problem, its probable causes, and the necessary actions to correct the problem. No wonder troubleshooting is considered an art. Anyone can shotgun an engine's problem, but it's extremely costly for the owner pilot, and it teaches the technician nothing. Precision Airmotive's suggested troubleshooting procedure for engines, their systems, and components follows 5 basic steps. First, study the symptoms. Secondly, isolate the system affected. Now, determine the probable causes. Then, check and repair the system. And finally, test and document your actions. This segment of our video aids the owner-operator in the troubleshooting technique for the RSA fuel injection system. Of course, read all bulletins carefully before removing a unit for compliance. Take careful note of the section which identifies the units affected by the bulletin and by the part number and serial number if listed. First of all, grab an inspection run-up sheet. You'll find one, which may be copied, by the way, on page 2 of Precision Airmotive's Troubleshooting Techniques for the RSA Fuel Metering System Manual, Form 15810B, technically speaking. Note that the inspection run-up sheet is divided into 2 sections, pre- and post-inspection. Remember, the more information you can supply to the factory, the better the factory can help you isolate your problem. Information like parts list numbers, how many total hours since a major overhaul on the servo unit, the engine size and number, and so on, are very helpful.
I think there's air in my fuel system. What's going on?
So, you think there might be air in your fuel system? Okay, let's take a look. First, take a 12 to 14-inch length of clear Teflon tubing and connect it between the servo unit fuel line and flow divider. This tubing should be clamped between 2 AN-style fittings. Now, start and run your engine and watch for air bubbles. It's very important that you not run your engine, by the way, without the cowling for sustained periods of time, as engine damage might occur. If air bubbles are discovered, locate their source. The primary sources are deteriorated fuel hoses, deteriorated main fuel pump inlet fitting seals. Take a look at Lycoming's Service Bulletin 374 for more information on this one. Airframe boost pump shaft seal leakage, damaged cones and flares on fuel line fittings, and fuel lines routed too close to the exhaust system. By the way, fuel fittings and lines can leak air and not fuel. If having the boost pump on improves operation, then a leaky fitting or hose is possible between the boost pump and the main fuel pump. A large air leak or boost pump shaft seal leak may not give improved operation with the boost pump on.
What is going on? Lately, when I'm in idle cutoff, my engine has a tendency to run on. What gives?
Keep in mind that when your throttle's in idle cutoff position, the manual mixture control on the RSA fuel injector will only reduce fuel flow sufficiently to stop the engine. It is not intended as a fuel shutoff valve. If your engine has the tendency to run on with the mixture in idle cutoff, better check the integrity of the servo unit. First, disconnect the fuel outlet lines from the servo. A flexible hose or clear tube can be attached to direct fuel from an end nozzle into a separate container. A baby bottle's perfect because it's calibrated in cc's. Whatever the container, the measurement process is critical. Now, open the throttle approximately halfway and place the mixture control level in the idle cutoff position. Turn on the boost pump and look for leakage from the outlet. Allow 2 minutes for this test. Hopefully there's no leakage. Great. If there is a leak, measure the amount of captured fuel and divide by 2, or however many minutes you let the boost pump run. This value is the cutoff valve leakage. Now don't be upset if it leaks. Even new units directly from the factory are allowed to leak up to 5 cc's per minute. If leakage exceeds 7 to 8 cc's per minute, dive into Bendix Service Information Letter 16, Revision 2, or later, to repair the servo.
My engine at idle
Sounds like a discontented duck. What do I do to smooth it out?
Though attempting to smooth out the idle speed, off-idle stumble is normally the result of having the following items misadjusted. The idle mixture link was misadjusted too long or too short. The idle speed adjustment was backed out too far, compensating for a possible induction leak. Or the magneto to engine timing was advanced from 3 to 5 degrees past the manufacturer's recommendations to smooth out the idle after the first 2 adjustments. Now, to correct the off-idle stumble situation, first, remove the idle mixture link and reset to the proper settings as set forth by the Master Clevis settings for parts lists in the Troubleshooting Techniques Manual, pages 11 through 13. Then, reinstall the idle mixture link. Again, refer to the Master Clevis settings list for exact Clevis settings for a particular parts list control. Of course, referencing this Master Clevis settings list is vital. Next, time the magnetos to the engine. Refer to the engine manufacturer's instructions. Now, start your engine and let it warm up. Then, set the idle speed to the recommended speed. Set the idle mixture to obtain a 25 to 50 RPM rise. Be sure to clear your engine after each adjustment. And now, reset the idle speed as necessary. If off-idle stumble persists, here are some possible causes. There's an intake manifold air leak. Perhaps the manifold drains are sticking open. Or there might be loose pipes or damaged couplings or O-rings. There might be a damaged nozzle or plugged air bleed. Perhaps the magneto internal timing might be wrong or shifted. The flow divider might be sticking open. There might be air in the fuel system, or the servo unit regulator is contaminated. In that case, send it in for repair. It's important to note that idle speed and mixture adjustments may be made with the boost pump on or off. If there's a noticeable shift in the engine's operation at idle with the boost pump on versus off, your servo unit might need to be returned for correction of pressure sensitivity. Take the time to troubleshoot effectively. You'll save money, time, and headaches. Remember, read all bulletins carefully before removing a unit for compliance. If you're in doubt, call us and ask for help. There are few things more frustrating than trying to start a hot engine. But sooner or later, the problem rears its ugly vapor lock in each brand of engine and all makes of airframes to some degree. But take heart. Using the right technique will save you lots of headaches. Let's take a look at the problem. An air-cooled engine starts hot between 15 minutes and 2 hours after shutdown. There are several factors which, when combined, make starting airplane engines, hot or cold, difficult. Aircraft engines are quite simple. They don't have chokes for cold starting, and they don't meter fuel precisely at below idle speeds. Aviation fuel many times fails to vaporize easily at startup. Weak, low RPM spark from magnetos, poor mixture distribution, and updraft carburation are all elements of hot starting. How to alleviate hot starts? Make sure your magnetos are strong, spark plugs are cleaned and properly gapped, and make sure your ignition harness is in good shape. Check your fuel injection system's idle mixture adjustments. There should be a 50 RPM rise as you shut down with the mixture control. Make sure your primer system works properly. Most fuel injection systems don't meter fuel very accurately at low engine speeds. The RSA fuel injection system calls for the priming to provide the majority of the fuel needed for the first few tentative combustion events. Fuel pressure is regulated at the throttle body, which means you can't force extra fuel through the system with the boost pump. And fuel delivery lines sit on top of the engine directly over the cylinder fins. Fuel is simply boiled out of the lines as heat ripples off the just shut down engine. Precision's RSA fuel injection system is a mechanical continuous flow system. Both the throttle and mixture control should be fully forward for maximum fuel flow. Here's the recommended procedure for the Cessna Cardinal with Lycoming. Throttle open 1/4. Boost pump on. Mixture, move from idle cutoff to full rich to obtain a 3 to 5 gallon per hour fuel flow. Then, back to idle cutoff. Boost pump off, and engage the starter. In theory, the engine will catch within a few revolutions, and you can push the mixture smoothly to a full rich as power develops, then retard the throttle to the desired idle speed. Now, here's a few common sense reminders. Tricks of the hot start trade. Always park in the wind. Open the cowl flaps and even pop open the oil filler door too. In this way, hot air escapes from the top of the cowling and helps to draw cool air out from the outlet area. It's very important to get airflow through the cowling after shutdown. Of course, when you're faced with a hot start, always follow the procedures presented in the operating manual.
So just wondering, could you imagine taking your car into the service station or even buying one? It's like, well, it's hard to start. Well, I know you have to before you start it, you've got to put your foot all the way on the gas pedal, and then you got to start it let it crank over 3 times. Then you got to pull it back. Then you got to shut off the fuel, then do it again, then turn the fuel back on. And like, I don't want to buy this piece of crap. You sure this thing's safe to fly? Oh, sure, once it gets going, it'll be fine. But it's kind of the way airplanes are. Okay, so that was it for the Bendix RSA fuel injection system. And now we're going to move on to the Continental system. And I was thinking about, well, first of all, hello, Christian. Thank you for joining us. That's where you say, thanks. It's great to be here, Kevin. He's not really here.
Hey, sorry I'm late.
Yeah, every day though. But we're glad you made it. Glad you made it.
Thank you.
Okay, so think before, what was I going to say? All right, so before we move on to the Continental fuel injection system, and this is really part of it, I want you to think about something. So, and MJ, you're gonna have to change your picture because every time I look at it, it looks like you have your hand raised. And I want to ask you, MJ, do you have a question? Your hand is up. So, if you take the RSA fuel injection system, and let me pull up something over here. We'll just pull up any one of these from current slide. Okay, so if we take this system and the whole system, and I were to say be at 60% throttle, and I were to take somehow and to freeze all of this. I went in there and however I did it, I managed to make the poppet valve absolutely, it's stuck. It's stuck right here in the 60% position. As I was to open the throttle, think about what would happen to the engine. It would continue, as soon as I open the throttle a little bit more, the engine is going to speed up. It's going to run faster because I've let more air in. That's what they're designed to do. And so the RPM is going to increase. You probably wouldn't notice anything right away. And if I open it more, RPM is going to increase even more and more and more. But at some point, it's just going to get leaner and leaner and leaner. But it's still, the RPM is going to increase as I open up the throttle valve. And that's an important point to think about as we look at the next fuel injection system, that what is really controlling what's happening as far as RPM goes is strictly a function of the throttle valve. This really is what keeps the engine at its RPM, set RPM, or increases or decreases the RPM. Obviously, as we open it, we want to keep the mixture the same. Therefore, because we're giving it more fuel, air, we've got to give it more fuel or the mixture changes. But even if we don't, it's still going to increase RPM. It's just going to go lean as it does that. And that's not a good thing, but it's what happens. Anybody have any questions about the wonderful video?
Not really. I just was wondering, what year was that produced?
How is that relevant?
Well, I mean, it's just like kind of cool to, history of the video.
I know it's got a Cessna 177 RG Cardinal, so, but the engine hasn't changed. So I could say it was built in even if I said it was done in the 60s, like I said, oh, that was put out in like 68. Okay, it's the exact same engine. Yeah. Nothing has changed. That's an IO 360 A1B6D engine in there. So you can tell that because it had dual mags on it. But it's the same engine that they're still using. Nothing's changed. It's got that dual mag on the back. It's got the RSA fuel injection system. It's got, you know, so it's not like, there's not even anything I can tell you that, oh, okay, well now if you're going to get a new engine, it's a little bit different like this. It's the same. So that's why it's one of the things about aviation. There was only one thing they mentioned that I know I've never talked about, and it was in their troubleshooting. They had talked about, I think I already got rid of the video.
Is it the cone thing?
What's that?
The cone or something like that?
No, they talked about drains, manifold drains. On a lot of aircraft, they have a thing, sometimes I call them sniffle valves. In the industry, we call them sniffle valves. And what it is, you have an intake pipe. Well, what they do is they drill a little hole in the bottom of the intake pipe, and they make like a valve, little valve with maybe a little spring. No, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to draw this. It's got a little ball in it. And yeah, we'll do that. We'll put a little ball in here, ball in there, and then we'll put the drain over here off to the side. So that would work. So when the engine is not running and you get any fuel that is leaking, it puddles up in here and it kind of finds its way around and drips out. But as soon as you start the aircraft up, there's going to be a manifold pressure leak, and it's going to suck the ball up right up here, blocking that manifold leak. And so now you no longer have a leak and you don't have a drain. So they're just these little balls that move around. And sometimes they get stuck down, and they don't, because my drawings doesn't have all the parts, they get stuck down, and when you're running it, you have a vacuum leak. And so that's what they're talking about as a source of a vacuum leak. And now I messed up this. So, open. No. There we go. Do that. That's better. All right, so we ready for Continental? I am. All right, forget everything you ever knew about fuel injection systems, because here comes Continental. And I'll make a few notes, and then I'm going to show you how it works. So because we're still in the fuel injection system, this became number 4. So it's Continental fuel injection. Fuel injection. There we go. So unlike all other fuel control units, unlike all other fuel control units, and by that I mean carburetors, fuel injection, pressure carburetor, unlike anything. And don't forget Continental, I'm just going to abbreviate TCM, even though it's not totally correct anymore. The TCM, Teledyne Continental Motors system does not measure air. Does not measure air. It has absolutely no idea how much air is going in the engine and does not care. Does measure air, but uses a unique fuel pump to deliver the proper amount of fuel based on engine RPM. So basically, I mean, that's, if you think about it, why aren't they doing that on more things? Basically just saying, okay, wait a minute. If you have an engine that is this very specific size and you run it at a very specific RPM, then it's going to need this much air. And then once you know how much air it needs, why don't you say, well, let's just give it that much fuel for the amount of air that it should be taking in. Why do we need to keep measuring the air? We already know. It's a given. You know, so they figured it out and said, okay, let's just build a system then that doesn't bother measuring air, and we'll just give it the right amount of fuel for every bit of RPM. But the funny thing is they can't do it with the computer. You have to do it mechanically. So therefore you have a mechanical system that again, like an analog computer that figures this out. So I'm going to show you how it works. Looks like everybody's done writing that. And I'll bring this up. There we go. So there's our fuel injection system. It takes all of these parts. Now, Continental, they have different styles. They all work on the same basic theory. So for example, this particular style right here is actually a style off of, like this one would come on an IO360, one of the smaller Continentals, probably even the IO240s, which was a newer one. It just took an IO360 and took 2 cylinders off, made the IO240. I've not seen this one on the 470s or 520s, but we do have some of the, in fact, I'll show you how one of these works. So what's different about this one is that the actual fuel control unit is split up between this part right here and the back half of this pump. So it gets really weird. But the pump from like right here down, it's all the same. It's just this one added the mixture on the back of the pump and then put the throttle control over here on this. They all are going to have a fuel flow divider, and they're all going to have nozzles. So everything else is the same. So we're not, more or less, we're not going to be studying this type per se, and not great. I put a picture of the one we're not going to look at. The one we're going to look at as, I don't know if I have a picture of that one. Well, I'll just show you. It doesn't matter. Okay, so here is how the fuel pump works. And I told you it's a very unique fuel pump. And you kind of got to be open to this and go, whoa, okay, that is really different. So where do we want to start? Because just like always, you have to have a bypass, because you have to start this thing up. And this right here is the engine-driven fuel pump. And you should recognize that as a rotary vane pump, just like we studied before. So here we have a rotary vane pump that just has some unique features to it. And that always reminds me, I keep saying unique, and it would be my joke with my sister. How do you catch a unique rabbit? Well, you sneak up on it, that's how. Sorry about that. All right, so let's start in idle, so, or off. So when the engine is off, just like before, we have to have some way to get fuel to the fuel control unit. So fuel control unit here is going off to the engine. So fuel control unit and then engine. So just like anything else with the engine-driven pump, I have a boost pump, and I flick on the boost pump, and fuel is going to come into here, and this is called the swirl chamber. Sometimes I say squirrel just to see if anybody's listening, but since we're online, I can't. So, in fact, one year I said it for like an entire day before somebody actually raised their hand and said, "Excuse me, are you saying squirrel?" I said, "Yes, I was," just to see if you're listening. All right, so the fuel swirls in here. And the reason why you swirl the fuel is to get any bubbles out of it. And so the bubbles rise to the top. And we'll talk about that later up there, but we get rid of the bubbles. And so the fuel comes in here. And of course, it wants to go to the rotary vane pump. But if the engine is not running, then it's not going to make it past that vane. It's not going to make it past that vane. It's not going to get anywhere over here. So it's got to find another way. So in idle, it's in bypass. Hang on a second here. I'm sorry. Why not just come to this next picture? And we'll go backwards. So in bypass, it just finds its way down here in those little bypass and goes up this way. And of course, it's going to go off to the engine. Now, it also has another way to go. So the fuel comes here, and it gets to make its own little decision. Do I want to go off to the engine, the fuel control unit, the engine, or I'll come up here? First of all, there's a path through here, and this is called an ejector pump. And so you can see it's just a venturi. So just like air, when fuel goes to the venturi, it's going to have to accelerate. It's going to create a low pressure, and that just sucks all the bubbles out with it. And then this goes right back to the fuel tank. So that's just always going to be there. It's a pretty small hole. It's doesn't really count for a whole lot, but there it goes. The fuel also has the ability to come up through and go this way, which we're going to talk about now, but I'll go backwards.
Kevin, there's obviously a little bit of fuel obviously coming out that and going back to the fuel tank with those bubbles, right?
All the time. All the time. All right. Not only in the boost pump, it's going to also act a little bit more like this. It doesn't just bypass, it just can't. But once the engine is off and running, this is what we want to look at. So the engine's off and running. So we still can, you actually in this system, you don't run the boost pump very long. It's better to shut it off because you don't want pressure coming in here and messing with any of this. So, so you turn off the boost pump when these things are running usually. So fuel comes in from the fuel tank, the fuel pump sucks it in. And of course it would want to go this way, but now the pump is running. So whenever the pump is running, just like with the other rotary that had the bypass, when does the bypass close? The bypass closes as soon as the pressure on this side is more than the pressure on this side. And it's got the spring helping it too. So as soon as this thing starts running, it's going to overpower the boost pump, shut down this bypass, and now we're running in the non-bypass mode. All right, so fuel comes out of here. It has, we'll say 2 choices because it's still going to go up through this little vapor tank, vapor return, but it's a really tiny little orifice and there's really very little fuel going back. That's not important. So fuel's going to go this way, or it comes up through the main metering jet and through a relief valve and back into here. Now, everything else we've ever studied, the main metering jet was controlled how much fuel went out. So you make the main metering jet open more. In fact, we would have put it right here, the main metering jet going this way. And we'd have said, well, whatever doesn't make it through the main metering jet then must be returned. This is completely the opposite. This is saying whatever doesn't go through this jet goes off to the engine. And so think about it. If I make this smaller, more fuel goes to the engine. If I make this bigger, less fuel goes to the engine. So it's completely backwards. And so what this is saying is it's provided an entire path, and whatever doesn't go through the path must go to the engine. Okay, so why do we have this check valve and why do we have this? So first of all, just like we've talked about before, the main metering jet on all of these engines never worked great at idle. They always sucked at idle, right? Because there wasn't enough fuel going through it to really make it work. The fuel is so low that it doesn't even see that as a restriction. It's like, hey, you know, you're not a restriction to me. You're just too big for the amount of fuel that's going through. So that's why this is here. So this is really this little bypass looking thing. This is what we call, or at least I call, the low end metering. And what that is it's you're allowed to adjust it, and it's like a pressure relief valve again. And so as fuel starts on idle, it'll come through, ignores this because it doesn't count, and it's going to hit this restriction. And this restriction is what controls how much goes this way at idle. So if I increase the spring pressure, less is going to go this way and more is going to go to the engine. If I decrease the spring pressure, more goes this way and less goes to the engine. So it works backwards and everything else. So anyway, we start running this thing and we're on idle, ignores that. This is set to the proper pressure, about 3 to 5 PSI, depending on the engine. And so it just keeps the right amount of pressure recirculating, and whatever's left over goes to the engine. And it just so happens that whatever's left over is the right amount. So we start accelerating, and as we accelerate the engine, of course, this is tied to the engine. This is going to move faster. It's going to pump more fuel. And then so we get in the off idle circuit, we finally get enough fuel coming through here, then it's going to start seeing this restriction and limiting how much fuel goes back this way, because now this doesn't work because this opens up all the way. It's wide open now, and it's done its best it could. So now that it's wide open and out of the way, we need something else to step in. So this is kind of when that steps in, sort of the mid-range to high end. This is now limiting how much fuel goes back. And of course, whatever's left over goes off to the engine. And that's really how the whole thing works. It's just that simple. So questions on that?
If that's the main metering jet, why does that say unmetered fuel pressure test?
Okay. I don't even read this stuff. Relief valve determines low unmetered pressure. Because everything in the pump is still considered unmetered. So they don't really, I don't know if they call it the main metering jet. I kind of do, so I've got to be careful with that. But it's not. Actually, it's not. It's not the main metering jet at all. It's main metering jet's going to come later, but it acts like one. So it's for sure not the main metering jet. It is just the high-end metering orifice. There's the word I want, high-end metering orifice. And this is the low-end relief valve. See that? Relief.
Okay. Thank
Low
you.
end relief valve, high end, what did I just say? Because that was the right word.
Metering orifice.
Yeah, high end metering orifice until I get a better word going to my head. We'll call it that.
So, so the low end is used when it's idle, and
Yes.
the high end metering orifice is used on high power settings.
Right.
Because of the low end spring or valve being all the way open.
Yes, you got it. That's exactly correct.
Okay, gotcha.
All right.
Because I was thinking, why use those two when one's redundant? But I see why now.
Yeah, because this doesn't work at idle and this
Yeah.
doesn't work at higher RPM. So you got to have both working, helping each other out.
Gotcha.
All right. Now,
If that orifice get clogged, then you're gonna get all the fuel then, right? It's not gonna regulate anymore.
right. If this clogged, you're just going to pump all this fuel to the engine. It's going to go super rich. That would be really bad.
I'm confused on what stops the fuel from just going to the fuel control. Like why does it go up to the orifice and all that?
Path of least resistance. We have a whole bunch more parts to add to this. So we are going to see a main metering orifice down this way. I could have drawn it in here, if we wanted to.
Okay, yeah, because I'm like, if it's just a straight shot to the fuel control, then why is it going anywhere else?
Nope, we're going to add a main metering orifice. We're going to add a mixture control, that can slide in and out and block another orifice. And then we're going to add a throttle, another one for throttle that's going to go in there, which is almost pretty much parallel to it. That can go back and forth and block that orifice. And so we're going to add a whole bunch of stuff. Oh, that's about what we're going to add right there. Not a whole bunch of stuff.
All right, that makes more sense.
Oh, good. I'm glad you asked then, so I can straighten that out. Okay, so that's, and I'll try and repeat this and go through it again if you need to. So let's see. So we did that, and then we had, okay, we did that, and we talked about the bypass. I'll stop here and talk about the bypass. One, keep in mind now with this particular system, and I'll hopefully bring its point up again, that it is all based on engine RPM, and that engine RPM means that as the engine speeds up, and that's what I started with, as I open up the throttle valve for more air, it will speed up the engine. If it speeds up the engine, it speeds up the pump. As it speeds up the pump, it gives the right amount of fuel in proportion. Slow down the engine, close the throttle valve, and this will slow down, and that will reduce the amount of fuel in proportion. But if something were to happen with this pump and it sheared and stopped, the engine would quit, right? So you got to have something. So you turn on the boost pump, and then the boost pump only, well, they actually make them they're 2-speed pumps on these things. So you can you're trying to run wide open throttle or high speed, you turn the boost pump, it just has the high and the low speed. It's not very bright. And so it's just going to come through and put a certain amount of fuel that really is not dependent upon this. So you're going to have some fuel problem managements. So that's why I say if I were going to have an engine that was going to have a fuel pump problem, I would much rather have the Lycoming system, because the Lycoming system doesn't really care much if you're running on the the engine driven pump or the boost pump. It doesn't care. Pump is pump. Just give me pressure. I'm happy. But because you have to have this exact ratio of how much fuel to how fast this pump is running, it's critical that this is tied to engine speed. And so once you remove that and you're just running boost pump pressure, you're going to have some issues. Now, I'm thankful that I've never actually tried to operate one of these engines either in flight or on the ground without this operating. But I imagine it would be somewhat of a handful because your boost pressure is not going to equal this. So I would imagine, and someday I'd like to talk to somebody who has, that if you're running along at cruise RPM and this pump fails and you have to go to the boost pump, you're going to be hunting around with your throttle to find the right spot where the throttle valve is open the correct amount for the amount of fuel coming in. And then you're going to be playing with your mixture a lot to try and make it work out. And you're going to be looking for a place to land reasonably fast. according to what I've read, you can only get a maximum of about 75% power out of this system once you lose the engine driven pump. But again, I've never met anybody who lost the engine driven pump. So
you're just looking for a place to land?
I think you would be. I would be. Place to land and a clean pair of underwear. So, and I'm gonna write some notes. We're gonna go back through all of this stuff. So don't be freaking out here too much, but I want to give you a good overview of what's going on. So this is the pump, what the pump actually looks like. I know I showed you before. I can go back a little bit. I said, well, my opening picture was this one. So this is one system on the smaller ones that I've seen. And so now everything else is pretty much going to be the other style. So this is more of the bigger pumps. And this is the newer, actually I take it back. This is the same pump. It's got the mixture control in the back. The newer style look like this, and they do have an adjustable orifice right here. So remember, if I go back to every other carburetor, I say, what are the two things you can adjust? You can adjust idle speed and idle mix, right? What can you adjust? Idle speed, idle mix. Is there anything else? No, there's nothing else. Okay, on this one, you have 4 things you can adjust and 2 that you had better not touch. If you touch them and you're out in the field, you're going to be in some trouble. If you're in my shop, you are definitely going to be in some trouble because you have just created a lot of work for somebody, usually me in the shop. You should never, ever, never touch this or that unless you are fully skilled and set up to adjust it. Because in order to adjust those, you have to bring in some specialized calibrated gauges. You have to plumb them in. You have to break open lines. You have to put in a bunch of T's. The thing it's called a porta test. I don't know if I have a picture of it. Let's see, I have a picture of it. Let me see. Hey, I do have a picture of it. It doesn't want to play. Hang on. It's coming. No, it's not. I broke my computer. There's a porta test. So you actually have to plumb this thing. These things are, I can't even find one anymore. Like Continental says, you can now just use some calibrated gauges. You need 2 gauges, but if you really want to do this right, you have 2 highly calibrated gauges, one for fuel pressure, one for manifold, and 2 of them for actual fuel flows. And you can see you got to select metered, unmetered, bypass, gauge vents. You're working with all of these things. And so it takes, I don't know, an hour or so to get this thing really plumbed in well. And then you're going to spend probably, if you're lucky, just about 2 or 3 hours to try and set up something that's messed up. Sometimes you get lucky and it doesn't take quite as long, but there's partial luck and partial skill involved in this thing. And the reason why is when you actually go to adjust these, the way it works is you start with the low end. And so you adjust your low end and you get it perfect. And then you take the engine up to high end and then you adjust your high end. And then you bring it back down to low end and you readjust your low end because it's going to be off now. Then you take it back up to high end and you can adjust the high end because now it's off because you adjusted the low end. And then you take it back down to idle and you adjust your low end because you touch your high end. See what I'm saying? You go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until you get it right in the middle. And that's really a terrible thing to do to an engine if it is really hot out. So, and then if you have a twin, then you got to match the other side because no self-respecting twin pilot will ever fly an aircraft if the throttles and the mixtures aren't exactly perfect with every single gauge in the aircraft matching perfect. And those are the best kind of customers to have because they will come in and they will, and I had one, he had a brand new airplane and I swear I chased it around for like a week. Then I'd go flying with them and make another fine tune adjustment because then you fly it and everything changes a little bit based on the ram air pressure and stuff. So again, there's 4 things you can adjust. Idle speed, idle mix, just like before, low end, unmetered, high end, unmetered. Don't touch these things unless you really know what you're doing.
So only 2 things.
What?
Only 2 things, really.
Only 2 things, idle speed, idle mix. This is not the idle speed. This is not the idle mix. This is not the idle speed. This is not the idle mix. Do not touch those. Don't touch the things on the pump. unless you really know what you're doing. This is still working with the same type. Oh, so we'll go back one. On this system, the mixture control is back here. I don't say most of, a lot of them, they're not. Look at all the pipes we got here. Got 1, 2, 3, 4 connections going on here. So let's talk about those connections, just so you can kind of maybe picture this in your mind. Laser pointer. So right here is the drain. It says dry bay inspection drain. This is also called a tattletale. Remember on the diaphragm pump, when the diaphragm failed, it had the little thing that started squirting and shooting out?
Yep.
Yep, it's 420, isn't it? Well, that's the same thing. So when the seals, either in the engine side or the pump side fail, this starts leaking fuel. If it's leaking fuel, that's a bad thing. So it shouldn't leak fuel. So this is just a way for you to tell, so it's drained overboard. And let me see here. Yep, it is a break time. So we will be back